Hello, everyone. This is the second part of chapter 4, or of the topic itself, cognitive, perceptual, and motor bases of early language and speech development. So, in general, just to summarize what we're going to discuss, it is all about the development of speech motor skills and phonological skills. And keep in mind that phonological skills, the phonological representations of the sound that the baby develops, that is what gives rise to the templates that are used to activate the motor system so you can produce speech. If there are no phonological representations, there will be no speech. And if the phonological representations are defective, then speech is going to be also defective. It will produce speech sound errors. So, just to summarize, children begin developing the rudimentary, the basic foundations of speech perception in the womb before they are born. And then they continue this robustly as soon as they are born. By age 2 months, they start the cooing stage, which is the production of the sounds that look like vowels. And then from there, they progress to the babbling stage around 4 months or so. And from there, 6 months, they begin or transition to the variegated babbling or the diversified babbling that lasts about from 6 to 8 months. And from there, between 8 months and 10 months, they go through a stage where they produce jargon, that is nonsense words, and that eventually leads to the first word. And from there, every stage, every few months, the child develops a group of sounds that they can produce, and they eventually, by age 7 years, they would have mastered the phonological system and the production of the sounds in particularly. Some of them linger, but 7 years is about the age. The motor system involves, or the motor production involves the control of the movements that you produce. It is not just enough to produce movements, but you have to produce refined movements that are targeted, that are focused on a particular cognitive representation that you want to exactly produce as it was internalized in the brain. So it involves sensory feedback. Sensory feedback means the sounds that you keep hearing, and the baby has to hear these sounds frequently, thousands of times, until the sound representations are encoded, and that will make them ready to produce at some point. So the motor behavior reflects and can influence cognitive development. In other words, as the baby is developing these oral facial muscular movements and refining them and so on, that is going to facilitate the connectivity of brain areas that are dedicated to the movement. And that will also connect with cognitive planning, because when you talk, you have to plan cognitively, and the conceptual system also, where you keep your concepts and so on. So it requires integration of the phonological and the motor systems. So, for example, repeated hand movements and object manipulation provides the auditory and tactile feedback that will then inform the higher levels of the brain, and that will also lead to the development of cause and effect relationships, knowing that when someone does something else can happen, or that for everything that happens there is a cause that makes it happen. When you look at the motor cortex, about 1/3 of it is dedicated to the hands. So the image you see here of the homunculus For example, you can see how big this is, the whole area here. Where you have the hand in the center. All of this area, for example, is dedicated to the movement of the hand and the everything that has to do with the digit movement and elbow and all of this. It's a big area. And when you have the homunculus, for example, based on how much of the cortex represents or controls how much of the body, you will find that the hands are the most represented, basically, and you can see how big they would be, just how extensive the area is. So that is like in a way to show that the movement of the hand, the sensation, whatever you do with your hands, inspires the connectivity and the development of major motor and planning areas in the brain. So the development of the speech motor system is going to enhance integration of cognitive and phonological systems with the articulatory system. The process of movement first begins about the 7th week of pregnancy, and where the pregnant mother is going to feel the movement of the fetus. The movements now, when the baby is born, the movements are basically reflexive. There is no goal, there is no intention like do something. It is all random and reflexive until the baby figures out that certain movements can be repeated, and then they can intentionally move. But that takes several months. So at the beginning, the baby has a lot of reflexes. Some of them are permanent and some are temporary. Temporary reflexes, they are present in the first few months, for example, and they kind of require the development of myelin or the progression of the myelination process, so that the transmission of signals can be fast enough to allow exchange of information. So we have the phasic biting. Phasic biting is if you put if you put your finger inside of the baby's mouth, immediately they start to bite on it. So rooting, if you stroke the side with any kind of object like a spoon or something, the corners of the lips, the baby is going to turn toward that. So that is called the rooting reflex. The sucking reflex has several steps, and we either discussed it in the previous section or that we will address it in this one. But if it's not here, it will be in the previous section. It has 6 steps that that show the maturation of that process by age 6 months. So the idea is that there's a pumping system that the baby uses to extract the nutrients from during the feeding, and as a result, that also increases awareness of musculature of the face and lips and so on. That will eventually enhance speech production. So, but these three, the phasic biting, rooting, reflex, for example, these are going to disappear by the 6th month or so. If someone gets a brainstem injury as an adult, they get these reflexes back. They are just kind of survival things, but they can be returned if there is damage, and they are a kind of a bad diagnostic indicator. If someone has a stroke, they just show that significant damage to the brainstem. Some reflexes remain throughout life. These are life-preserving functions, so we need to have them, including gagging, yawning, sneezing, coughing. Again, these emerge in the first few months, but they continue throughout life. The development of speech and motor during the first 4 months involve several stages. First, when the baby is 4 months old, they engage in about 4 hours of non-nutritive sucking. What this means is that they are not feeding. They just kind of use their fingers or anything that they have. They keep, putting it in their mouths and sucking at it, and that means they are experiencing the movements, and they are getting sensory feedback and are activating the motor system through these. So this facilitates the emergence of and the development of control over oral facial musculature. Oral facial musculature is simply a fancy word to say muscles of the face and the mouth. So it is not a disease, it is not a disorder. Tongue cupping and strong tongue protrusions, these are two important skills that are required for swallowing, and they emerge also during the first 4 months. The baby at that time has better control over the posterior oral structures, and then eventually, as the baby is developing, they will gain more control over the anterior. So the progress and development in terms of motor skills, it develops from the posterior structures to the anterior structures in the oral cavity. By 6 months, the baby is able to bout. They're able to draw the lips independently from the mandible. That means they start to have differentiated skills. At that same time, they can differentiate digit movement, for example. Before that, when they can't, early in life, they just point with the whole hand. But at some point, they start to differentiate digit movement. That will coincide with these skills, like drawing the lips independent from the mandible. It shows neurological maturation. By 8 months, the baby is able to seal the lips while chewing and also while swallowing semi-liquids. Semi-liquids are honey consistency. They are kind of thick liquid. It is not like, it's about honey consistency. Lateral tongue movement is important for feeding, but also for speech production, tongue mobility. They are able to perform these skills by 8 months. 11 months, they are able to elevate the tongue, to have tongue elevation. And remember, there are several sounds that require tongue elevation, like all the alveolar sounds, all the palatal sounds require that. And 11 months, we are speaking about a baby who either has the first word now or just about to produce the first word. The baby is able to chew soft solids, and while doing this, they compress their cheeks and draw the lips, just the normal chewing that we do. The baby is able to close the lips while swallowing liquids. And again, this shows quite a progression and the development of the oral facial musculature. Please do take a few minutes to watch the videos and observe the babies as they drink from a straw and as they feed, and just see, you will find what the research is showing is quite consistent with what you see. So here is the sucking reflex as a process. It is as a process. The baby doesn't acquire this, doesn't learn it. It is a reflexive skill that the baby is born with. And it begins with when they feed, say breastfeeding or bottle feeding, they seal off the nasal cavity. So posteriorly, the nasal cavity is joined with the oral cavity. By saying sealing off the nasal cavity is by elevating the velum, the soft palate, to meet the adenoid pad or the posterior pharyngeal wall, and that closes the space between the palate and the posterior pharyngeal wall. We call this space the velopharyngeal port. So the baby closes the velopharyngeal port by elevating the velum, creating a seal, and will separate the oral cavity from the nasal cavity. This is done during the sucking reflex. It also is done when you produce all sounds except for the nasal sounds. So then that what they do is they move they elevate the velum and then move the jaw down. So this creates a vacuum suction as they seal the velum, the velopharyngeal port, and then they simply now seal the lips, and all they do is lower the jaw and bring it up repeatedly, and that creates a vacuum, and that is gonna extract the nutrients. And they also require the tongue. They protrude the tongue forward and back, and that is going to affect every time they push it forward. It creates negative air pressure in the back. They pull back. The negative air pressure is gonna be now in the front. So as they draw, it will be almost like the pump of a needle drawing back, and that creates negative pressure that will suck, will extract the milk out. So these are the steps of 3 steps of the sucking reflex that you need to know. So the sucking is enhanced by the posterior anterior mandibular movement. Also the jaw goes forward and back as well. So that is 1, 2, 3, 4 steps. Now, in order to produce sounds verbally, we have to have a well-established phonological system. Phonological means phonological representations of sounds. Articulatory or articulation means using the muscles and integrating their movement of each muscle with the other ones and producing sounds. So hearing is the single and only way for developing auditory perception, and auditory perception, creating the auditory images of the mental images of the sounds. That is the only way to develop verbal or spoken language. So that means that the baby must be exposed to a rich environment, an environment that can give a lot of sound stimulation, hearing sounds, hearing words, hearing sentences, and engaging and listening and reading, continuously. So the more that you do this, the better the language development. The less that you do this, the less the language development. In terms of the first time that the baby gets exposure to sounds of the native language is in the womb, is in utero, and we said that at least the last 4 months of pregnancy, the auditory system, the ears are developed, and the cochlea is adult size. The baby can hear, and they have particular elements of the language, like the prosody or intonation of the language, that they recognize. They recognize the native language, the spoken language of the mother, and also the voice. So they have a lot to begin with. They can discriminate sounds in any language in the world. Of the 6,000 languages in the world, they can distinguish that. The skill continues until 7 months, and then there's a window of time between 7 months and 11 where the window is just about to shut down, and if the baby is introduced to other languages, they will do that. But once they hit 11 months, then the network begins to specialize just for the native language, and the baby will lose the skill to discriminate in foreign languages. As we discussed in the class, this has advantages and it has disadvantages. So the advantages is that the baby will progress fast in the native language, but then they would tune out foreign languages or other languages as noise. They do not even pay attention to them. It doesn't mean that they cannot acquire them. It just simply means that the baby does, in order to learn that after, there needs to be a systematic effort and motivation and so on. It is not as spontaneous as it used to be. So now, in terms of related skills, the auditory perceptual skills at age 6 months predict later language development. The baby's ability to discriminate different phonemes of the language at 6 months of age, that can predict how well language development is going to be in later months. Especially, for example, the skills that can be predicted are word comprehension and the ability to produce words and the ability to understand phrases. Now we are speaking about the age up to 24 or even, to maybe even 26 months. So what happens at 6 months? 6 months can predict what happens in 2 years. By age 5 months, the baby responds to her or his name when you call them. They know you are calling them. 6 months, they respond to mommy or daddy. Like when someone says, mom is coming or dad is coming, they would look and they would know what you are who you are talking about. By age 8 months, they store sound patterns of words. They look at the word, like say book, as a block of sounds. That's a sound pattern, but not necessarily understanding the meaning. In terms of prosody, that is how you modulate stress, raise it up and down, and distribute it in the sentence. So in conversation, 80% of English words tend to carry a primary stress on the first syllable. For example, any single word, any word that has a single syllable has a stress by nature. So that is, the stress is there at the beginning. Any word that has 2-syllable words, one of the syllables will be stressed. Like, so for example, perhaps, or saying like say classroom, for example. Classroom, that's a 2-syllable word, but the stress comes at the beginning, classroom. So 80% of English words are like this. They carry the stress on the first syllable, given that if we are speaking about a multisyllabic word. So from birth, infants are sensitive to the stress where it occurs, and also to the rising and falling intonational patterns. And they are exposed to this before birth. So they are particularly attracted and interested in stressed syllables. They like exaggerated speech. And you will notice that in parent or infant-directed talk, they are particularly, that style of speaking has an elevated stress pattern. Intonation patterns, how you distribute, or in other words, the melody of speech, facilitate recognition of word boundaries. At some point early in life, as you speak, the baby kind of speaks, all the sounds are all together. Initially, you have a stream of sounds. You have to learn how to kind of segment them, how to make them into chunks. You have to realize that they are syllable combinations and words that are next to each other. So the baby has to learn the spaces between words and the spaces between syllables, the spaces between sounds as well. So, and intonation is one of the one of the cues that enables the baby to develop that skill. So by 5 to 6 months, infants rely on prosodic cues, raising a lowering pitch, to discriminate questions and from statements like, did you go? Or you went to the store? So you raise pitch at the end to make to show that you're asking a question, or you went to the store. You drop down the intonation. That means you have a statement. So that is the typical pattern. Questions have a rising intonation, and sentences or statements have a lowering intonation at the end. We call these intonational or intonation contours sometimes. The concept of phonotactic organization or phonotactic constraints, it means that there are particular combinations, particular rules that govern where sounds and sound combinations occur, and what combinations are possible, are acceptable. For example, to make syllables, for example, what combinations of sounds can occur together, which ones can come at the beginning, which ones can come at the end, and so on. Like, you will never find a syllable, for example, that begins with for example, PT at the beginning of a word, but you find that at the end of the word. It only comes at the end of a word. For example, there are also phonotactic regularities, or combinations that are predictable. You know that they will be coming. So these will be repeated eventually, and the baby internalizes them. The phonotactic regularities mean the likelihood that certain sounds or sound combinations and syllables will occur at a certain location of an utterance. So, for example, infants prefer more frequently familiar sounds or sound combinations. Also, the probability, the expectation that a certain combination is going to happen, like when you say, yesterday I talked, before you say the t, or I talked, or yesterday I logged, and then logged in. So the d or t, I'm speaking phonetically, not grammatically, like ed and so on. But that's at the end, that will be expected. Once you say yesterday, you will predict that you put the d or t sound at the end of the past tense verb. So these probabilities facilitate word boundary recognition, the ability to segment words in a sentence or an utterance. The syllables that are heard frequently and the baby hears more often, they are the ones to occur first, the ones that the baby can say first. As a matter of fact, sounds, there's a statistical analysis of sounds, so that you see the number of, if you take 1 minute of my speech as I'm speaking, and you count all the sounds of the language that I'm saying, and you see which sound occurs more often in one minute or 1 hour, then you will see the ratio of a sound, how common that sound is in the language, and how many times we hear it every day compared to another sound. That will mean that this sound that is heard more often will emerge more often, because you have to reach a certain number of times that you hear, so you can build your phonological representations. So the sound zh, as in garage, it is the latest occurring sound. It is the sound that is the least occurring in the language. It has the least frequency. It's very rare in the language, as compared to m, t, d. So infants begin producing the syllable consonant vowel syllables, consonant vowel like ta, da, that emerges before vowel consonant, high. And I'm sorry, that's not vowel consonant. Say, for example, ow, no. Ow is possible because wa is a consonant, ow. So vowel, and the wa, ow. So the vowel and the consonant emerges later, because in the language, consonants and vowel syllables consisting of consonant vowel, they are more often occurring. So then reduplicated consonant vowels or syllables made out of a consonant plus a vowel, they emerge first. So say consonant vowel ta, da, da da, repeating the same syllable, ta ta, the same syllable. But then after that, you have unduplicated vowel consonant vowels like pa ta, for example. So these come first CV and then CV, CV, and then VC, VC. I might I didn't give a good example for this one. Ana, ana. So you can think if you think about a syllable that begins with a vowel, and then it has a vowel and a consonant, and then another syllable that's a vowel and a consonant. At, and then atat, for example, just as an example. Infants could acquire the initial and final syllables before the middle ones. The reason is that there is a principle in memory that's called the immediacy and recency principle. If I am saying a whole sentence, what has the whole, like a major priority in memory, you remember the very first part and the very last part. So the person will be biased. Like when you tell me that, more likely I will remember the first and the last. And that is the same for words. So what are the implications for that when we work on treatment? If someone has difficulty, say, producing the R phoneme or the L phoneme, you notice that in many cases, they will have it will be easier for them to produce it at the beginning or at the end of a word than in the middle. So that means that the treatment will progress either from the beginning or from the end based on what the child is able to produce. And finally, you go to the middle, because the middle will be more challenging. So also, infants are able to recognize pauses of up to 1 millisecond. These are tiny pauses. There is some kind of a process that we do as we speak. If the baby can demonstrate this at in a couple of, I think, weeks or a few weeks after birth, when you speak, the rhythm and the vibrations you make as the baby is listening, they produce body movements, tiny body movements that are in synchrony with your voice and with the little segments of your speech. And we do this as adults as well, but these are not you need to have a machine to measure these. They're called something like entrainments or something like that. So these predict the ability to segment individual sounds and to recognize that speech is not just made of a random whole bunch of strings of sounds, but of certain combinations of sounds that follow each other. The ability to segment, measured at age 5 to 6 months, predicts the better language development at age 2 years. So that means if the baby's segmentation skills, word segmentation skills, are well developed at age 5 or 6 months, when you test them, that means that they will produce better language at age 2 years. So you can appreciate now how early language skills serve as a foundation, as a bedrock for later developing skills. So if the foundation is missing, what is going to build on that foundation is not going to be there. 9 months, the infant uses prosodic and phonotactic cues to identify individual sounds in connected speech. And also high probability sound combinations that are produced more frequently, and the baby can predict these. Also signal, these are used as cues to show boundaries of words. For example, the d, t, the d and t occurring in, say in a sentence, that is a high frequency occurring combination. These do not occur in a single word. So when you say like bedtime, and I put that together, bedtime, so that means the baby now is able to recognize a boundary between the word bed and then time. And also the d, t will be a combination that is predictable, that the baby will hear. It is frequently heard in the language. The f, for example, is another frequently occurring combination between words or syllables, like butterfly. Low probability sequences signal word or syllable boundaries. So there's a difference. One signals sound combinations in a single word, signal the boundaries between words or the boundaries between syllables. When you say white cup, the t, k is one of these, the b is one of these. You can identify many words on your own, like similar to these. So the size of vocabulary the child has, in terms of the beginning in the first year, for example, that is going to determine the development of phonological representations and phonological processing. What this means is the more vocabulary the child has, the more that they can work on here. But the less that they have, the less that they will be able to develop. It wouldn't give them the skills that they will need so they can develop phonological skills. Limited vocabulary from the very, very beginning, from the very few months of life, is going to have a devastating impact. So we cannot emphasize that enough. Limited vocabulary leads to decreased phonological skills, and that causes deficits in word and syllable segmentation. That will cause deficits in spoken language. It will cause deficits in spelling and in reading. This causes difficulty in repeating phoneme sequences, for example, in word initials. And that by itself, the difficulty in repeating phoneme sequences, that means that vocabulary development enhances and drives the early development of working memory, or including short-term memory. So children who do not have a strong vocabulary will eventually have limited working memory, and when they improve in vocabulary, working memory may develop better, given that they don't have a neurological disorder. So by the time the infant develops phonological skills, the motor system will have developed enough to a level where they can produce speech, say, in the late stage of babbling, and when the time that they produce the first word. At that transitional stage, which is 11 to 14 months, the first word emerges around between the 11th month and up to the 14th month. That's the normal range. Beyond that is going to be kind of a late talker. So at that stage is going to be the stage where the phonological system in the brain, the phonological representations, will be integrated with the motor system and the cognitive system. So the baby knows when he or she wants to talk, and they get the template, these sound representations, fed into the motor cortex, and that is going to activate the oral facial musculature and the speech musculature. Remember, there are up to 90 muscles involved in the production of just a single word. So this integration could be disrupted, number one, by limited auditory input. If you do not provide enough stimulation, meaning you do not interact enough or for a prolonged period of time to provide the necessary stimulation, or by abnormalities in the auditory system that will cause disruption or will prevent the signals from traveling, and that will disrupt the formation of auditory pathways and auditory, the whole system connectivity is going to be messed up. We discussed that during the hearing, the anatomy of the auditory system in the AMP class. In terms of now, we'll look at the vocalization process and the stages of vocalization. Speech motor development is a process that continues for several years, up to the 7th year. It might go a little beyond for people who have speech sound problems. So speech development during the first year begins with the first cry and advances to reduplicated babbling that eventually will lead to jargon and the first word. So newborn vocalizations, as we repeatedly emphasized, are reflexive. They include fussing, crying, and other sounds that they make while feeding. But crying gives rise to the control over the oral facial musculature, especially, and also the airway, the airstream. They are able to regulate the inhalation and exhalation processes, and that will be instrumental for the production of the ability to talk, because as we exhale, we capitalize on that to verbalize, to speak. So in terms of resonance is the ability to separate the oral cavity from the nasal cavity through elevation of the soft palate and preventing air from going through the nasal cavity when you produce the oral sounds, and also making sure that the velopharyngeal port is open when you say the sounds the nasal sounds. So at the beginning, the baby doesn't have control at birth, over the resonance system, and they produce like sounds that look like resonant sounds. We call them quasi-resonant nuclei, like sounds that look like speech sounds, but they are not. So by between 1 and 2 months. So these quasi-resonant nuclei, the reason why we call them nuclei is that a nucleus is a vowel because it serves as the nucleus of a syllable. So these are non-crying vowel-like sounds with occasional consonantal elements. Like they have something that looks like a consonant, and they are produced during feeding, during talking or smiling. Please watch the video and observe. We watched one of these videos in class, it may be the same, and observe the sounds that the baby makes. See how many that look like a vowel, how many may have some kind of stopping that look like consonants. So the earliest phonemes babies produce are m, n, g, k, and h. And that is, we're speaking now the cooing or gooing stage, where we have a lot of sounds that look like vowel sounds. By 3 months, the baby produces syllable-like vocalizations in response to speech of others. And again, watch this video and you can see the interaction between the mother and the baby and how these sounds, we have looked at how there's a wait time and turn taking during this activity. So these are often accompanied by index finger flexions. The baby just flexes the fingers of the hands. And then babbling begins at the end of the 4th month, the beginning of the 5th month, and it lasts throughout the 6th month. So month number 5 and 6 of the baby's life is babbling. You watch the video and you will see. Babbling is the production of random consonant vowel syllables. Consonant vowel means pa, ta, da. So, but these occur kind of in a random way. So consonant vowel is the earliest and predominant type of syllable. It occurs first because it is the most frequent in the language. And statistic principles say that the more common sounds in the language that are heard most often are the ones that give rise to phonological representations, and that means these same sounds and syllables will emerge first. So that I hope this makes you recognize and keep in mind the importance of the stimulation and the kind of stimulation the baby gets. So the baby modulates the volume, rate, pitch of babbled syllables in response to social interactions. That means that the baby is almost like trying to ask a question using the same, using just babbled sounds, or trying to express excitement or fatigue or anger and so on by just changing intonation. Frequency of babbling is determined and it is reinforced by social interactions. So when you have a well-knowledgeable speech pathologist observe the babbling of a child, they will be able to determine if this child is developing the requirements for speech to develop. For example, is that frequent? Is the baby babbling frequently? Is there a diversity? Is the baby changing pitch and volume and so on during that babbling? So the baby stops babbling to listen to others. That means they are aware of others. They need to take a turn. So once speaks or vocalizes, the baby pauses, taking a turn to wait, and then the adult pauses, then the baby vocalizes. It's just an amazing turn-taking process. Characteristics of mature babbling, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We need to know this really well and compare this to children who have hearing loss. I don't want to spend too much. I am afraid in case the video stops before I finish. So it has a high and low pitch sounds. The baby sometimes growls and produces guttural sounds like growling, nasal fricative sounds that like